We got things to do.
So this project begins over at the miter saw, where I break down two 1x10 boards down to 14 inches length each. I then bring them over to the table saw to joint one edge, which I had to redo after I planed them to thickness to take a little bit of the cup out of the boards. After they are planed down to a little over 1/2 inch thick, I bring them over to a set of parallel clamps, apply glue to one side, and clamp them down for over an hour. After about 15 minutes before the glue gets too hard, I come back with a chisel and remove the excess glue on the top and bottom. Next I can find the approximate center of the workpiece and trace out a rough circle about 12 inches in diameter, which is going to be the final size of the clock. I can then mark out the rough locations of where the hours are going to be, as my plan going forward was to put a nail in the center and a nail on each hour, and hopefully the electricity would burn in such a fashion that you would have 12 distinct patterns. Unfortunately, this is not quite how it turned out, but nonetheless, still ended up with a pretty cool pattern. Now, if you don't know anything about how this wood is burning, what I'm doing is applying a mixture of water and baking soda to the top of the piece of wood, driving 2 electrodes, which are the nails, into the board, and I'm connecting them up to a modified microwave transformer. This is a step-up transformer that takes 120 volts AC and steps it up to about 2400 volts AC. The high voltage travels across the water and creates a burning technique called Lichtenberg figures. Now, I know all the associated risks and I'm taking many precautions in this. If you don't know what you're doing, please don't attempt this. It will kill you. So Lichtenberg burning didn't leave me with exactly 12 individual hours distinctly marked out on this board, so I just tried to add as much burn marks as I could, as this would leave me with more contrast as I carve out the numbers on the CNC later. So the next step is to bring it to the wash tub and, using a soft bristle brush, scrub the hell out of it and get all the soot and burn marks off there. After fully rinsed off, I let it dry for a few hours. Now over at the CNC machine, I attach it with 4 screws in each corner and mark out the center, which is where I'm going to set my origin point in all of my code. I then insert a V-groove bit into the router first of all to carve out the individual numbers of the clock, and then it's going to run a script to put a chamfer around the entire clock. This is going to be followed up with a 1/4 inch spiral downcut bit to cut out the actual shape of the clock. In Fusion 360, I set up for 6 tabs to hold the clock in place to the stock body. I use a chisel to smack out these tabs and disconnect it. However, I didn't actually set my depth quite correctly, and a little bit was left on the bottom, so I just used the edge of the chisel to trace around it and get a rough edge. I then bring it over to the disc sander and clean up all the edges to a perfect circle. The next step was to give the top a light sanding, as I tried to keep as much of the figure on there as I could. The next step was to mark out the location of the clock mechanism, set the depth on my router, and using a straight bit, hollow out an area for it to sit recessed. I can then sand off the fuzzies around the edges, and using an appropriate size drill bit, drill out the size for the mechanism of the clock. I then install a keyhole bit into my router, and this is how the clock is going to be hung on the wall with a simple screw. Next, I install 3 drywall screws to space it off the ground, as I'm going to be spraying on a water-based polyurethane as the finish. 2 coats in total, sanding between. I can then remove the drywall screws and clean up the little bit of edge that's around each screw with a chisel. I then can install the clock mechanism with 4 dabs of hot glue on the face and then strips of hot glue along the sides to hold it in place permanently. The last steps are to reinstall the hour, minute, and second hands, making sure they don't rub on each other, and then finally putting the battery in and setting the time.
Looks like your last year's model.